There's a commonly accepted idea that living in the city is worse for one's mental health and overall well being than rural life is, but there's a lot of research that shows that there might be two sides to this story. So it's important to note that while there certainly is and are a lot of aspects to living in the city that have a higher probability of leading to certain mental health issues and general unhappiness and lower well-being. This doesn't mean that city living is worse for one's mental health or well-being from an overall standpoint. So the point of my argument also is not to say that city life is necessarily better for one's mental health or well-being than rural life is, but rather to assess the pros and cons of both types of lifestyles and to bring light to the fact that there are so many different aspects that go into somebody's mental health and somebody's happiness and somebody's well-being. And so we might find that there really isn't a clear-cut answer to the debate over which is better. A key component that impacts happiness and well-being is physical health, and this has been a major topic of interest and research that has been conducted addressing the debate between happiness in cities as opposed to in rural areas. One point that is often brought up in the argument that city life leads to worse health and a lesser well-being is the fact that there's a large amount of air pollution and general uncleanliness in urban areas. This is a valid point, and air pollution certainly is not beneficial to health, but research shows that there are some negative aspects of rural life that could offset this. A study led by Gopal K. Singh for the U.S. Health Resources and Service Administration found that rural residents are significantly less educated and less informed about health risk factors, which in turn has led to a much higher percentage of smokers and tobacco users in rural areas than in urban areas, which at least somewhat offsets the negative effects of air pollution in the city. When assessing this particular information that compares the negative health impacts of urban life to that of rural living, it is important to ask the question, is air pollution more unhealthy than smoking and tobacco use? The truth is, one is not worse than the other. Statistics from the World Health Organization show that about 8 million people die from tobacco use each year, and a study published on The Lancet found that about 8 million people die yearly from illnesses caused by air pollution. So this tells us that when we're comparing the two negative health outcomes of the city versus the country, they sort of cancel each other out in terms of which is worse than the other because they seem to have pretty much the same effect. Aside from looking at the negatives of these types of lifestyles, it's helpful to compare the benefits of both types when assessing which is healthier. Continuing the discussion about physical health, people who live in rural areas have easy access to fresh organic foods because they live close to farms that produce these items, and it's also cheaper to purchase these healthy organic foods in rural areas, which makes it so that it's more accessible to people with lower incomes who may not have the money to consistently shop at expensive organic markets in the city. In the country, people have much more exposure to nature in the open air, and a study published in the U.S. National Library of Health found that greater exposure to the natural environment can lead to a lower blood pressure. On the other side of this argument, there are so many examples of how city life is beneficial to physical health. For one, most places that you need to travel to on a day-to-day basis are in close proximity to each other, which means that people walk and bike a lot more in the city. On the topic of exercise, there are also many gyms in the city with more options in terms of location, price, and available machines and facilities. In the city, people have easier access to healthy food choices because there are so many more options in general, and they're all in close proximity to one another. And there are grocery stores and markets with fruits and vegetables on nearly every street corner. People in urban areas have greater accessibility to and more options for healthcare, doctors, and medicine. And in fact, the study by Singh found that people who live in cities now have a slightly higher life expectancy than people in rural areas. So all of these examples further support the idea that city and country life seem to be pretty even in terms of their health effects. Another major point that is frequently brought up by people arguing that city life is worse for one's mental health is that people in the city are more likely to develop mental health issues such as anxiety and mood disorders and even schizophrenia. A study posted on the journal database called Nature states that this is because the busy, fast-paced nature of cities causes an overstimulation of the brain and adds a significant amount of stress. Although this suggests that mental health issues are worse in the city, Many studies also show that people are generally more happy in the city because it's easier to find friends, meet new people, and find things to do than it is in the country. There's also the argument that it's much cheaper to live in rural areas, but on average, people have a significantly higher income in the city than they do in rural areas. It seems that whatever argument you bring up to suggest that city life is more unhealthy and worse for well-being can be countered with an opposing argument. An important thing to keep in mind here is that there are numerous advantages and disadvantages to both city and rural life, and the examples that I brought up are only a few of the many, many ones that there are. This makes it extremely difficult and if not impossible to determine which is ultimately worse for health, happiness, and general well-being. The real takeaway from this assessment is that there's no objective answer to the question about which is worse, and different people may have different experiences with the place that they live. So people who live in the city shouldn't be driven away from where they live, and people shouldn't be too worried to move to a city just because some research tries to convince them that city life is inherently and objectively worse for health and well-being than rural life is.